Good afternoon, folks. I'm Waldo, and yeah, good afternoon, all things open. Now, they say that behind every great person is somebody else, and thanks to Dorothea, I get to be that somebody else. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank our organizers and sponsors right as we kick off. But hi, I'm Waldo. And due to some unfortunate AV things, I'm dual wielding today. We'll see how this goes. This is my contact information, and if you're so inclined, later on, you can come get a sticker from me. But hi, I'm Waldo, and this is Fear and Loathing in Systems Administration. But first, a little housekeeping. This talk isn't endorsed by anyone, strictly speaking. This is me. Just a boy standing in front of his community, asking it to make things a little bit better. I will take questions after the show if we have time, but if you really want to talk, I encourage you to reach out to me later. My only rule is that if you heckle, you have to be funnier than I am. So what I need to know now is how many of you, who you are. By show of hands, how many people are new to DevOps? Awesome, welcome. How many of you are like systems, networking, operations, storage? Again, show of hands. Wow, that's quite a lot of you. How many software development? Well, likewise, a lot of hands. How about like still hard tech, but kind of pushed to the outskirts? This is QA or DBA or security. Done. There we go. Okay, so what about other business functions such as financial, legal, HR, administrative? We should get some of those people at this conference next time. How about management or product? I like to joke and say people who at one point maybe have been useful but now do other things. Yes. And do we have any design folks? Woo! Knew there's always one. Who did I miss? Did I miss anybody who has a role that is outside of what I described? Yes? Yes. Leadership development, training. Now, the reason I ask is because I often give this talk in the context of a DevOps Days or DevOps track at a conference. And it's important to realize that DevOps is not development and operations, or DevSecOps or DevQAOps, where you're awkwardly smashing things together. DevOps is the company, and it's everything. It's really about aligning people and perspectives towards goals. So now, as I give these DevOps conferences, if you've ever been to one, you're going to be expecting to hear lovely stories about sunshine and rainbows and happiness and cooperation and Trello and so on from all of our favorite companies. Now, these are fantastic because they give us hope and a goal, but they seldom describe the struggle of the path. They describe their now and what it was like before, and maybe a key change or so to get there. But there are usually some missing steps. There's usually enough content for a DevOps drinking game. Now, there is such a game, but I don't recommend playing it during a conference for health reasons. But instead of talking about the glorious utopia that is the DevOps promised land, I'm going to talk about the first steps along that path. Now, one final point, I'm going to be moving quickly. Here is the safe word for my talk. If at any time you're feeling overwhelmed, please say the safe word clearly, and we'll take a break. So with that, let's get on with the show. Man, dual wielding is hard. If there's one thing that I want you to get out of my talk, it's that you need to remember that the people you interact with are, in fact, people. When you have a conflict with somebody at work, it's most likely because your incentives and theirs are in conflict. If there's a second thing I want I want teams to adopt, it's that responsibility doesn't end when the product hits production. Responsibility for a product only ends when it leaves production. There's a Chinese proverb, and I wish I had a better citation than that, but I don't, that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is right now. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. So the number of times I've heard this statement is amazing. The best thing about the phrase DevOps doesn't work is because the people who say it are absolutely right, even if it is for exactly the wrong reasons. Now, who tends to say this? I'm going to use the term sysadmins as kind of a shorthand for a very broad spectrum of jobs. The people often have very widely scattered job titles, but it's most commonly a combination of systems, network, or operations mixed with administrator, engineer, technician, or analyst. And even while the suite of names is shared, the actual job descriptions and their day-to-day functions can vary so widely that the jobs are essentially incompatible. In some companies, these will be the people with the best computers, but in others, they have the worst. The workplace probably isn't very nice, and in my career, it's been oddly consistent that there's like no natural light. If there's a pager rotation, they're on it. If there isn't a rotation, they're basically just on the call all the time. Their work's largely invisible unless things are broken. Define operations. And this might be what you'd say their typical day looks like. But if one word could be used to describe these people, I think we could agree it would largely be cynical. I mean, who here has ever had a party to celebrate your successes? You met a goal, you published an application, you met a deadline. But were the ops people there? Or were they celebrating? Or were they huddled over their laptops in the corner? Or did they even make it there? Did you remember to invite them? So one sees a bunch of new faces around the company, and that's when you find out a new product's been announced, a new project, a new initiative. And you go, well, this is the first I'm hearing about that. Who's going to support this new project? And they get a blank stare. Well, you are. The of course is there whether or not it's spoken out loud. So you ask, how many people am I going to get to hire to help me support this new workload? Oh, come on. It won't be that much work. Ooh, sorry, there wasn't anything left in the budget. Or, some variation of the team player or good soldier speech. But they may be the only people who see that a lot more effort is going into building new things than running the things that are making money now. Ask them if they've ever had their training budget slashed or rejected out of hand. Or maybe because another group just used it all up before they even heard there was one. So still, describing sysadmins, they probably have a working knowledge of a half dozen programming languages, but they most often think in shell. They probably know at least 3 ways of testing whether a port is open and have a warm spot in their heart for a handful of Unix command tools. But they have no patience for people who won't lift a finger to help themselves. They may have participated in a DevOps initiative that largely consisted of team rename, or they were helpfully suggested to that they should get some config management and monitoring so we can do the DevOps now. Or maybe so we can agile. But when they hear DevOps or agile, what they think is, well, let's take those same people who can't hit a planned release cycle, or even make whatever effort they need to squeak by the change board requirements. Let's give them unfettered access to production. Because clearly, I'm not paged often enough. When bringing a problem to management or the engineering group, they're likely to be told, well, but changing this would mean the engineers have to do some work. Can't you just deal with it? And when something like that is said, what they hear is, well, I think that group is more important than you. They're more valuable than you. So you knew this meme was coming, but it's so pervasive because the attitude is pervasive. It's not intentional, but actions speak louder than words. And when you see all of these things come together they become patterns, and see if you don't start turning cynical. So how do you maintain your sanity in the face of increasing job scope, increasing demand for velocity, and little hope for an effective headcount? Not to mention that you have to continue juggling the existing volume of requests and just keep the machine running. Please note, I'm not saying just. There's nothing just about this situation. There's nothing simple about any of it, and justice hasn't been seen in a long time. These changes are difficult. They will take work, and they will require convincing other people and other teams to help join in your cause. But the first step towards getting help is admitting that you have a problem. The problem probably isn't technical, it's almost entirely social. Because sysadmins have typically been responsible for the environment. And the easiest way to ensure that things don't change unexpectedly is to lock everyone else out from it. Now, locking helped with the goal of keeping out unexpected changes, but had a number of unfortunate side effects. First, a kind of learned helplessness sets in. Your customers and teammates became so used to being hands-off that they don't know what a reasonable level of effort is for any given request. Now, some teams settle on a pattern of hands-off production, but you have access to staging, but this is fraught with peril, really. Since people are uncomfortable making any changes, all changes end up being made by the sysadmin still. Your time ends up being taken up by performing lots of low-value tasks. Now, the most common problem that stems from this is configuration drift. This is when you have different settings in one environment than the others. But when the cost to discover what production looks like is high, it's more likely that people will either use defaults, make assumptions or guesses, or use the same configurations that work in their IDE. So, the good old works on my machine. Now, this is a problem well solved by config management, or if you have static images, it's well helped by that. But you still need to be willing to trust your peers and give them access. You want to be part of the process of validating changes. You could put in a pull request and code review process that your engineering peers are going to be very familiar with. They're going to be very accustomed and comfortable with, and it helps them learn. Granting access to see the existing configs and the ability to propose changes also shares the responsibility for your team's environments and contributes to feelings of ownership. But denying your colleagues the ability to affect necessary config changes contributes still to the problem of config drift and learned helplessness. You need to stop feeding the machine. Your value isn't doing the work, but being able to make the decision to have it done. Now, I'll be the first to say that automating all the things is a flawed goal. It's usually set in the context of a project rather than a philosophy of continual improvement. While I agree that everything should be automated, not everything should be automatic. Decision-making is complex, and attempting to codify all the possible decision trees is a fantastic way to make yourself insane. Break down your steps, automate certain pieces, and iterate over time. Now, you shouldn't have to engage in an automation project to improve your environment. Build time into your schedule to solve a problem. Pick something that happened this week or this sprint this month. Pick something that's rough or manual but repeatable and remove a small piece of friction. And then move on to the next one. Iterate and improve over time. See, an automation project, my dear friends, is ocean boiling if I ever saw it, and I'm really good at boiling oceans. But ideally, you have time blocked out for continuous improvement. And if not, create a meeting or a weekly project to do so. Review the results, the issues that you've experienced, and pick something to improve, and just make it habit. Whatever you don't automate must be documented. Try to recognize whether, which provides more value, writing documentation, or whether you'd be served by executable documentation, i.e. code. Now, beyond the typical benefits of docs, it also serves as functional requirements for when it can be automated. Because your documentation is up to date, right? We need to make sure that you and the business also agree on why you're there. You should attempt to pick apart the pieces of your work and attempt to describe them. A way to make this a fun exercise is try to use other job titles to describe your roles. Code cleric or release ranger. Or are you an internet plumber? How much legacy systems spelunking do you have to do? Would you describe part of your role as production customs official? Are you the gateway to production? And if so, are you actually equipped to be able to do that? Here's a quick test. When you say, no, that can't go, do you get overridden? More importantly, is this what you want to do? Before you can ask for help, you'll need to prepare. Most sysadmin teams don't have a healthy relationship with the rest of the business. So the sysadmins will have to initiate the healing. Take somebody to lunch. Ask questions and listen to the answers. This isn't the time to defend yourself or your team. It's time to find out how the business views what you're doing now and hear how things are working from somebody else's perspective. Ask them what they think your team's role is towards achieving success. Ask what they think your team does well and where there are gaps between what you have now and excellence. You probably recognize the words that they use, but you need to go out of your way to speak the same language. To communicate your message, you're going to need to meet your peers on their own turf. Now, this might seem terribly unfair. Why can't they meet me on my terms? But I'm guessing that hasn't been working out so well for you so far. Not only do you need to use their language, but you need to communicate using their medium. It's probably not IRC, and writing an email is a really great way to get ignored. But if you're speaking to management, be prepared to write a presentation. Executives especially love to see a slide deck. It doesn't have to be slick like this. It probably shouldn't have much in the way of sounds or transitions, but a presentation can help lay the groundwork for a real conversation. And now that you've described your role, we also need to describe everything that you support. It's entirely possible, and likely even, that the people and teams that you support don't actually know what you're responsible for. It could be argued that they shouldn't need to know. But if you've been saying no to protect yourself, it's a sign that you're significantly overextended. You need to have a real discussion with your leadership about your role, your scope, and your staffing. In order to have this discussion, you need to prepare. You need to come up with a fairly comprehensive list of the products and teams that you support. There's a list of every team and all of their products, the components and tasks that belong to you for each of them. And don't forget all the components that, in most companies, nobody seems to own, but somehow people come to you to implement or fix. CI, source control, project managing tools, wikis, these all seem to be very common examples of things that just suddenly happen in the environment and are now business critical, but nobody really owned. But what about, are you also responsible for directory services or the virtualization platform? In small to mid-sized companies, you might also have the mail or chat or phones. You might even do like workstation purchasing, provisioning, or printers. But seriously, like when you figure out your responsibilities, get into detail. This isn't the time to skimp. Every app. Here's the thing. Your leadership might not know what LDAP is, but they'll understand if nobody can log into their machines or they can't pull information to build reports. And by the way, no code deploys can happen. Are you, in fact, sure that you know what your company's goals are? Would your C-suite executives agree with your take on it? What do you need to succeed? How much more staff do you need? What tooling or equipment would help you to be more effective? And most importantly, are your incentives aligned with your goals? Do your incentives align or conflict with those of other groups? Now, in order to have any meaningful discussion with people in your company who aren't necessarily technical, you need to be able to relate in a language that they speak. Now, regardless of team duties, the lingua franca of most teams is money. As engineers, most of us prefer to think in terms of the tech itself. But in order to describe an impact, everybody can translate to money. It's difficult and uncomfortable habit to get into, but it's really helpful. I encourage you to consider the components of costs that go into every incident or task. What's the cost of a main site outage, or the cost of this particular feature not being available? And is money and effort being put into things that matter? Further, show how systems relate. It doesn't have to be terribly detailed. Describe the features that the customers use are reliant on X, Y, and Z pieces of infrastructure. You have to be able to explain why you have to do this particular piece of maintenance. Explain what the cost is if this piece breaks. How much would it cost to invest in improving the automation around it, including delegation and self-service tools? Describe how doing this maintenance reduces your context switching, unplanned outages, and the lost reputation of your company. How can you delegate more work to your peers? And what benefits can come from your peers' increased agency? And what do you need to do to achieve the implementation of those enabling technologies? Draw the lines from your LDAP to your storage to your CI tool to code testing and getting artifacts deployed to production. Then show all the other systems that have similar dependencies. Now, once the picture starts emerging, showing how everything is reliant on really unexciting things like LDAP and your storage cluster and that janky collection of angry shell and Perl scripts that keep everything working, realization is going to start to dawn. Congratulations, you've just effectively communicated value. Now, if your company claims that they're doing agile, but they can't do continuous delivery, they're not really agile. The whole point of that framework is to improve the delivery of value to the customer and the business. That's where your gaps are. Now, it's not DevOps talk unless we have some Conway's Law. Now, when people read this, they usually think of an org chart. And you see how smooth and linear those lines are, how much sense they make. This can help, this helps people to understand the context when an organization starts to exceed Dunbar's number. But don't confuse a reporting structure with a communication structure. It's the communications that are key. Now, if you don't know about Conway's Law, you'll be at the mercy of people who care about the org chart. But if you and your people have those regular communications with people outside of your reporting structure, those themselves are communication structures. Lunches and friendships are way more effective than status meetings. Go pollinate. I firmly believe that the key to making business work better and improve the lives of your operations is the pager. Are the sysadmins held responsible for apps written by other people? Who gets paged when the app goes down? If it is your systems folks, how does that even make sense? Get your developers on call for their apps. Sysadmins should be escalated to. See, developers can triage and troubleshoot their own apps more readily than ops because they wrote it. And if you call yourself a full stack developer, excellent. You have no excuse to not carry a pager. But the developers, they don't have a background in operations, but they do get to call in the cavalry when they get stuck. They don't need to know everything about every system, and they don't need to resolve everything. When a fault occurs and they need help, they pair with the systems folks as they diagnose, troubleshoot, and resolve. That way, they don't need to escalate the next time this thing breaks, or they can collaborate on a more permanent fix. Stop, listen, and collaborate. See, when teams aren't responsible for their products, when they aren't paged when it fails, they're numb to the pain that they inflict. They're not trying to cause pain, they just don't feel it. They don't suffer the consequences. It's especially easy to argue for this in teams that proclaim they are using Agile again. If they claim they want continuous feedback, there is no feedback more visceral than being waken up by a pager in the middle of the night. It's almost inevitable that we'll hear, well, we can't interrupt our developers, as if it makes sense to interrupt somebody else. Even being aware of the pain, hearing how many times I was paged last night, can elicit sympathy, but that's a far cry from the experience of being paged yourself. Here's another thing. I know you don't want to be woken up at 3 a.m. because of something you wrote. But how do you think your ops team feels about being woken up because of something they didn't write? This is what that list of responsibilities we were talking about earlier is for. Asking each team to take responsibility for their own products, you're still likely to have a hefty list of services that you provide that you are on call for. Now, as you're pulling all this information together, now's the time to point at those staffing numbers. This may be a matter of the places that I've worked, but I've never seen a developer to operations ratio lower than 5 to 1. In most places, it's much higher. It's usually somewhere around 10 to 1. By adding these teams to their own pager rotations, they drastically reduce the load and burnout potential on the ops folks. By not adding them to their own pager rotations, they're complicit in the burnout of ops folks. Now, sysadmins have a reputation for saying no. The people who are asking are probably not trying to make your life worse. They're just trying to get their work done. They may not even know what their simple request involves, or that it might not even be necessary. But by not having responsibility aligned with authority, you may have been stuck with the pain of other people's wishes. You know that fulfilling their request is going to cause you pain, so you understandably say no. But what happens next is that they escalate until they hit somebody sufficiently important enough to override you. And this is the basis for why sysadmins feel steamrolled by everybody else, and everybody else feels held hostage by sysadmins. All hope is not lost. If you're a sysadmin, stop saying no. Take a cue from improv comedy. Nothing kills an improv group's flow more than somebody responding with no. They say yes and. Now, since that doesn't really make sense in the sysadmin context, we change that to yes, but. Yes, but is a very powerful thing. It can be used to get you help. Yes, I can set that up for you, but we don't have the capacity to run it for you. What happened there? You agreed that the request is reasonable, and you set expectations to the level of support that you can give. You left the requester with several options to continue the conversation. They might have a hiring rec that they can't fill. Perhaps some of their engineers join your team as part of a rotation or a lateral move. They'll need mentorship and training, but this kind of cross-training is invaluable. It's a force multiplier, and it sets precedent. So maybe these people take responsibility for the thing. They run it. They get paid for it. And of course, you'll probably have to be an escalation point still to help them when it fails, but it's their product. Again, this helps set precedent. See, most sysadmins are stuck doing tasks that provide very little value because they restrict access to their peers. To my mind, there's one really perfect example, and that's what I call playing telephone. And when I say that, I mean the situation where somebody, let's say a developer, they need some logs, but they don't have access to the box. So you fetch the log request and give it to them. No, not that log, this log. You fetch that. I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. Could you check over here for something else? And so on and so on. Now, I don't know what you're trying to prevent by restricting access, but if this scenario ever happens to you, you should know that you're providing negative value. Again, let's remember that these are your peers, and they are not out to get you, and they can probably be trusted to be reasonable human beings if you meet them halfway. With that framework in mind, it's time to demonstrate some trust and delegate to them. Give them access. Your value is not in the logging credentials that you have. Otherwise, you're just a poorly implemented terminal as a service. Even better than giving direct access is tooling. Logging into a server should be an anti-pattern for most work, and some modern infrastructures actively discourage it. You need better tooling. So with the example of logging, let's talk tooling. First, logging into boxes to get logs is just dumb. Sure, you could wrap a tail command into a rundeck job, but let's centralize those logs instead. Now, syslog is better than nothing, but not by much. Shipping logs is easy, but consuming them as something useful isn't. Batteries are not included. If your company wants to spend the money on Splunk, then encourage that. Splunk is pretty fantastic. It's going to be expensive, so if you're not going to spend enough to use it for everything, there's going to be confusion as to what's in there and what's stored elsewhere. I encourage you to go all or nothing on this. Elk, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana is a great middle ground. Elk is free, as in beer, and is very featureful. But if you don't want to run it yourself, there are plenty Elk as a service Elk in the cloud providers. My company, Datadog, happens to be running in such a service now, so ask me anything. But regardless, take your centralized logging tool of choice. Provide your customers, your peers, with the URL and credentials, and send them links to how to use documentation and get out of their way. One tip that I can give you is that you should have should have every application that you can export their logs in JSON format, just right off the bat. Because if you don't, you're going to have to write something along the lines of a grok filter, and they're not any fun. Now, this is an example implementation from my history where we defined a log provider for applications. It's right there on screen. But if somebody's being stubborn about changing their log type, then fine. No, it's fine, really. They can write that grok filter themselves. It's 500 characters of regex. Look, you don't need to run all the things. If someone asks you to run this command for me, you need to put a button on it. Rundeck is, again, a fantastic tool for putting a button on it. It's pretty easy to make high availability. You tie it into LDAP for credentials, manage permissions, and by shipping its logs, see what I did there, you get auditing of who did what and when. If you have some data that must be restricted, try to isolate those cases from the rest of your environment. You shouldn't have to restrict everything just because one thing does need isolation. So we have to ask, why would you have to deploy other people's code? If you're a sysadmin, are you providing any value in that activity? Because if the deployment doesn't go well, you're launching right into another game of telephone. What if you make it easy for the product team to do it? Empower them with trust and tooling, and make it easy for them to do the right thing. Give them tooling to see if their deploys actually succeeded. Now, logs are a start, but metric dashboards that show changes in performance conditions and error rates make it really easy to see what's going on. Sorry, I live in Orlando, so everywhere I travel is dry in comparison. But this freedom that you give your peers doesn't come free. Providing tooling doesn't absolve the development teams of the need to communicate. In fact, it's likely they're going to have to communicate more. They're going to need to be watching those dashboards and logs to see for themselves the success of every deployment. Now, I say they in this article a lot, and that's because by default, most organizations are set up to have a strong us versus them culture. It's only natural for there to be an us and a them. While it may not be my job to do a given thing, it is our job to ensure that the team and company are successful. Now, while that sounds like some happy-go-lucky, tree-hugging pop psychology nonsense, and it kind of is, the goal here is to get you, the beleaguered sysadmins, the help that you need to improve the capabilities of the business and to have a better life. Now, if I may be permitted one final thing, the psychological damage done to sysadmins by their peers can make us seem bitter and cynical. So I encourage my people to try to see that they aren't trying to make life difficult for you. It's very likely that responsibility and authority are misaligned. I likewise encourage my peers to try to take steps to make their lives better. And it may seem like the onus here is on the part of the sysadmins. They're helping to keep the plate spinning, and much of the work described on them here is on them. And that's a fair point. We sysadmins have to put in the effort to make a life better for ourselves. Because the way we've been working clearly hasn't been working out for us. There's so much more to this topic, particularly in the shift away from a systems team to supporting a bunch of to a bunch of product teams that are largely self-sustaining. Also, a lot of companies, what they really want is a PaaS. But given the option, your systems team's going to go out of their way to provide the most half-assed PaaS that they can build. Not because they want to be half-assed, but because they want to build it themselves. But these things are going to have to wait for another day. So when somebody says DevOps doesn't work, they're absolutely correct. DevOps is a concept and a philosophy. It's a professional movement based on trust and collaboration among teams to align them to business goals. But a concept doesn't do work, and a philosophy doesn't meet goals. People do. Please remember, just like Soylent Green, DevOps is made of people. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank my editor, Sean Moten, for his help on the work in the original article. Our conference organizers, who've done a fantastic job, and the DevOps community at large. Thank you for being so welcoming and sharing and supportive. Now, as your speaker, I advise you to take one antagonist, one company credit card, and 2 lunches. Let's go plant some trees. Thank you very much. I'd love for you to provide feedback via the conference app. And if you'd like a sticker, please come find me later.